Before this evening was over, one man would be exposed in front of his own investors. One man would walk out of the room without saying a single unnecessary word, and everyone at that table would spend the next several weeks trying to explain what they had just witnessed. This is that story. Marcus Delvane was the kind of man who needed every room to know he was in it. Hedge fund manager. Self-made millionaire. Loudest voice at every table. That evening he had a target. Steven Seagal was sitting directly across from him. "You're the movie guy, right?" Marcus said, loud, deliberate, designed to land. "The one who does all the kicks and the flips." Laughter around the table. Steven picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, said nothing. "I mean no offense." Marcus continued, leaning forward now, feeding off the reaction. "I'm just saying, movie fighting isn't real fighting, is it?" More laughter, more silence from Steven. The host shifted uncomfortably. He had invited both men for a business dinner. Not this. Marcus went further. "Come on, honestly. Has Steven Seagal ever been in a real fight, or is it all camera angles and stunt doubles?" The table went completely still. Every eye moved to Steven. Steven set down his glass, looked at Marcus directly, and said 4 words quietly. No anger, no performance. 4 words that made the latter disappear instantly, and told everyone in that room that this man had been waiting, very patiently, for exactly this moment. What those 4 words were, and what happened next, is something nobody at that table expected. Those 4 words were not a threat, not a boast, not a comeback, just this. "Are you sure, Marcus?" Quiet. Still, completely controlled. And something in those 4 words carried a weight that nobody in that room could immediately explain. To understand why, you need to understand who Steven Seagal actually is, not the movie version. The real one. Steven moved to Japan at 17, alone, barely speaking the language. He trained in Aikido under masters who had spent their entire lives refining one idea, that the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who never loses control. He earned a 7th Dan black belt, one of the highest certifications in the world. He became the first foreigner in history to open an Aikido dojo in Japan. He trained Navy SEALs. He consulted with law enforcement agencies. 40 years of building something real. Marcus knew none of this. What Marcus knew was that 6 months earlier, Steven had declined his investment deal. A Nevada real estate project, glossy presentations, confident numbers, big promises. Steven had reviewed the documentation carefully, asked specific questions, and said no. Marcus had not taken it well. He spent the months after telling people in their shared circle that Steven didn't understand business, that he was just an actor, that his reputation was smoke and mirrors. Every word got back to Steven. Steven said nothing. Did nothing? Because Marcus had just made the most costly mistake a person can make. He had looked at Steven's silence and decided it meant weakness. He had confused patience with fear. He had spent 6 months building a story about a man he had fundamentally misread. And then, needing an audience, needing to win publicly what he had lost privately, he chose a dinner table full of witnesses to finally say it to his face. What Marcus did not know was this. Steven had spent those same 6 months learning things about Marcus's project that Marcus desperately needed no one to know. He had been waiting for exactly this room, exactly this moment, and now that moment had arrived, and Steven was just getting started. Marcus laughed off the 4 words, performed confidence for the table. "Sure, I'm sure. I'm just asking an honest question. Has the great Steven Seagal ever actually been in a real fight?" Steven looked at him. 3 times, he said. The laughter stopped, once in an alley in Osaka. 2 men. It ended in under 8 seconds. Nobody moved. Once outside a restaurant in Los Angeles. A man was threatening a woman. He needed surgery afterward. I visited him in the hospital. Complete silence. And once, Steven paused. Looked directly at Marcus. I was sitting across a table from someone who thought I didn't know what he was doing. He let that land. That one didn't require anything physical at all. The table did not breathe. Marcus forced a smile. "Is that supposed to be about me? You tell me?" Steven said. And then, before Marcus could respond, Steven did something nobody expected. He stopped, picked up his fork, took a bite of his food, looked toward the window, as if the conversation was already over, as if Marcus had already lost, and just hadn't realized it yet. This was the moment people would later describe as the turning point. Not the words. The silence after them. The absolute, unhurried indifference. The message underneath the composure. You are not a threat to me. You are not even interesting to me. I will deal with you at a time of my choosing, and right now, I am finishing my dinner. Marcus had 2 choices. Walk away with whatever dignity remained. Or push harder. He pushed. You know what your problem is, Steven. His voice had changed now, sharper, uglier. the real voice underneath the performance. You think because you made some movies and learned some moves in Japan, you're untouchable. But out here, in the real world, money is what matters. And you walked away from a lot of it 6 months ago. The table tensed. Every person there understood what was happening now. This was no longer a dinner conversation. This was personal. Steven set his fork down slowly, looked at Marcus with the same expression he had held all evening, calm, clear, completely unbothered, and said 5 words, quietly, precisely, like a door closing. I didn't walk away, Marcus. 1 beat. I read the permits. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then, would you like me to tell everyone here exactly what those permits said? Marcus's face went white, because he understood, in that moment, that Steven had not come to this dinner unprepared. He had come loaded. And he had been waiting, patiently, the entire evening for Marcus to give him the opening. Marcus had just given it to him. The table was holding its breath. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, and then Gerald spoke. Gerald, the host, the mutual friend, the man who had carefully arranged this entire evening, set down his glass and said 5 words, Marcus, tell them, or I will. The room cracked open, because Gerald was not a neutral party. Gerald had invested in the Nevada project, significant money, placed in trust based on documentation Marcus had personally presented, permits, approvals, projected timelines, all of it delivered with the kind of polished confidence that makes people stop asking questions. For 3 months Gerald had been trying to get answers. Where was the Stage 2 clearance? Why was the environmental review still open? When would the capital become accessible? Every call got a smooth response. Every email got a professional delay. Every meeting got rescheduled. Gerald had invited Steven tonight for one reason, not for business, not for introductions. Because Steven had said no 6 months ago, and Gerald had always wondered why. And he needed someone in that room whose judgment he trusted completely. Someone who had already seen through Marcus before the money was on the table. He hadn't planned for it to surface like this, but here it was, and he was done waiting. Marcus stood up. This is completely inappropriate. This is not the place. Sit down. 2 words from Steven, same tone as everything else all evening. Quiet, flat, certain. Marcus sat down, and that single involuntary moment of compliance said everything that Marcus's performance all evening had been trying to deny. Everyone saw it. Even Marcus knew what it meant. Steven looked around the table slowly. 3 investors. All of them with money in the project. All of them watching him now. The permits Marcus showed you were real. Steven said, I want to be clear about that. He did not show you fake documents. He paused. What he showed you were Stage 1 approvals. Early stage. What he did not tell you, what was already known at the time he was pitching this room, was that the Stage 2 environmental clearance was under active challenge from a federal review board. Silence. That review process can take 18 months. It can take 4 years. There is no ceiling on it. During that entire period your capital does not move. He looked at Marcus. I know this because when he pitched me, I called the county office directly and asked one question, is Stage 2 clear? The answer took 4 minutes to get. It was no. One of the investors leaned forward. Why didn't you tell anyone? Steven looked at him steadily. I said no to the deal and I moved on. It was not my place to make decisions for other people. What I did not expect was that the person whose place it very much was, whose legal and ethical responsibility it absolutely was, would instead spend the next 6 months telling people I was the one who didn't understand business. He looked at Marcus one final time in that exchange. You didn't attack my intelligence tonight because you were confident, Marcus. You attacked it because you were afraid. Afraid that if people in this room took me seriously, if they asked me why I said no, the answer would lead exactly here. He opened his hands, and it did. The table sat in complete silence. Marcus had no answer. For the first time all evening, the loudest man in the room had nothing left to say. But Steven wasn't finished. When he stood up to leave, the final words he delivered directly to Marcus's face is the part of this story nobody forgets. What followed was 30 minutes of quiet devastation. No shouting, no dramatics. No performance, just Steven, methodical, unhurried, completely calm, asking questions that Marcus could not answer cleanly. Timelines, transfer records, communication logs, permit numbers. Each question landed softly. Each incomplete answer landed harder, and through all of it Steven remained exactly the same. Same posture, same tone, same expression. As if he were discussing the weather. As if dismantling a man's carefully constructed facade in front of his own investors was simply something that needed to be done, and he was the one present to do it. This was the brutality nobody had seen coming. Not rage, not retaliation, something far worse. complete indifference to Marcus's discomfort, while systematically removing every layer he had hidden behind. When it was over, when the last question had been asked, and the last evasion had been noted, and the silence had settled permanently over the table, Steven stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked at Marcus Delvain directly for the final time. "I want to say something to you," he said. "And I need you to understand that I mean every single word of it." The table was absolutely still. "You walked into this dinner tonight with a plan. Make me look small. Make yourself look powerful. Remind everyone in this room that you have money and I am just an actor who got lucky. I understand exactly why you did it." He paused. "When someone says no to you, when they see through something you have built and they walk away, it damages something inside you. Something that needed that yes to feel real, and the only way to repair that damage is to damage them back. To make them the fool. To rewrite the story so that their no becomes their mistake." Marcus said nothing. "But here is what you did not account for." Steven's voice stayed completely level. Not cold, not cruel. Just clear. You cannot rewrite a man who does not need your version of the story. You cannot damage someone who is not waiting for your approval. You cannot make small what was never measuring itself against you. He let that sit for 3 full seconds. Then, "I have trained for 40 years. Not to fight. To be unaffected. To walk into any room under any pressure, against any person, and remain exactly who I am. That is the only real victory in any confrontation. Not destroying the other person. Staying whole yourself." He picked up his jacket. "You tried to humiliate me tonight in front of people whose respect you wanted me to lose. Instead, you handed me 30 minutes to show them exactly who you are. One beat. I didn't do that to you, Marcus. Another beat. You did it. I just didn't get out of the way." He nodded to Gerald. "Thank you for dinner." And he walked out. The room did not move for a long moment. Then one of the investors, the quietest man at the table, the one who had said nothing all evening, looked across at Marcus and said 4 words. Quietly. "Permanently, I want my documentation." That sentence, from a man who had arrived at that dinner as Marcus's ally. That was the moment everyone understood what Steven Seagal had just done. He had not attacked Marcus. He had simply stepped aside and let Marcus destroy himself. In the weeks that followed, the story spread, not because Steven talked about it. He never said a single word publicly. But 14 people had been at that table, and 14 people had witnessed something they could not fully explain, but could not stop thinking about. Something that did not fit neatly into the categories most people use for moments like this. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a takedown in the conventional sense. It was something quieter. And somehow, because of that something permanent, the Nevada project was placed on formal hold within 2 weeks. The investor group retained independent legal counsel. Documentation requests were filed. The regulatory timeline, the one Marcus had never disclosed, was confirmed exactly as Steven had described it. 18 months minimum. Potentially longer. Marcus issued a public statement. It was long, it was carefully worded. It used phrases like miscommunication and evolving regulatory landscape and commitment to transparency going forward. It convinced nobody who had been in that room. 3 of his longest professional relationships ended in the months that followed. No public drama, no press, just the quiet, irreversible withdrawal that happens when people who witnessed something cannot unknow what they saw. His reputation, the one he had spent years constructing, the one that depended entirely on projection and performance and other people's fear of missing out, began to come apart at the seams. Not because of anything Steven did, because of everything Marcus had done himself, finally seen clearly. Gerald called Steven privately about a week after the dinner. He apologized. Said he felt responsible for the whole evening. Said he should have created a different setting, handled it differently, protected everyone from the collision he had quietly engineered. Steven listened to the entire apology. Then said this: "You did the right thing. You waited until the room was right and the moment was clear. Most people never develop that patience. Don't apologize for it." Then he said goodbye and hung up. Gerald later said that those 2 sentences changed the way he thought about timing permanently. Because that was the lesson underneath the lesson. Everyone who watched that evening took away something about composure, about staying calm, about not reacting when someone tries to provoke you. But the deeper truth, the one that takes longer to see, was about something else entirely. It was about the 6 months before that dinner. Steven had known about the permits the entire time. He had the information, he had the credibility, he had every reason to make calls, send messages, warn people quietly, protect the investors Marcus was assembling. He did none of that. He waited. And the reason he waited was not passivity. It was not indifference. It was not even strategy in the conventional sense. It was understanding. Understanding that information delivered at the wrong moment disappears. It gets dismissed, disputed, explained away. The messenger gets discredited. The truth gets buried under the noise of the conflict around it. But information delivered at the right moment, in the right room, in front of the right people, when the person it concerns has just spent an entire evening removing every layer of protection they had, that information does not disappear. It lands. It sticks. It becomes the story that 14 people carry with them for the rest of their lives. Steven Seagal did not walk into that dinner to expose Marcus Delvane. He walked in because a friend invited him. But he had learned through 40 years of training and living and watching how power actually moves through rooms, that the truth has its own timing. And the only skill that matters is knowing how to wait for it, not impatiently, not resentfully, not with the energy of someone counting down to their revenge, but with the settled, unhurried certainty of someone who knows that what is real does not need to be forced. It simply needs to be present. When the moment arrives, the final part of this story is the one that will stay with you longest. What Steven said privately, after all of it was over, reveals everything about who he actually is. A month after the dinner, someone asked Steven Seagal a simple question. Not a journalist, not an interviewer, a young student at one of his training seminars, 19 years old. Had heard pieces of the story secondhand and wanted to understand one thing. Why didn't you just walk away at the beginning? He asked. Why stay at that table at all? Steven looked at him for a moment, then said this. Because walking away was what he wanted. And I don't make decisions based on what other people want from me. That answer contains everything. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, not the moment Marcus sat down without being asked, that answer. Because it reveals the foundation underneath everything Steven did that evening, and everything he had done in the 6 months before it. He was not there to win. He was not there to punish. He was not operating from anger or pride, or the need to restore something that had been taken from him. He was simply, completely, immovably himself, and nobody could touch that. There is a concept in Aikido called mushin. It translates roughly as no mind, not emptiness, not blankness, clarity, the state in which ego stops interfering with perception, where fear stops distorting what you see, where the need to perform, to protect, to prove, all of it falls away, and what remains is simply presence. Pure, undistracted, unshakable presence. Most people spend their entire lives without experiencing that state for a single moment. Steven Seagal had spent 40 years building it as a permanent condition. And what Marcus Delvane discovered, at great personal cost, is that there is no strategy that works against a man in that state. You cannot provoke someone who has no ego to protect. You cannot humiliate someone who needs nothing from the room. You cannot diminish someone who is not measuring themselves against you. Every weapon Marcus brought to that table, the public mockery, the crowd laughter, the performance of dominance required one thing to function, a target that could be wounded. Steven was not that. But here is the part of this story that matters most. And it is the part that is easiest to miss. Steven did not achieve that state by being naturally unaffected. He did not come into this world immune to other people's opinions. He was not born without ego or pride or the desire for respect. He built it, deliberately, painstakingly, over decades of training that was as much about the mind as it ever was about the body. Every session on the mat was a lesson in letting go. Every moment of difficulty was an invitation to either react or choose. Every provocation from training partners, from circumstances, from life, was practice for exactly the kind of moment that arrived at that dinner table. The mat was just the classroom. The dinner was the exam, and Steven walked in 40 years prepared. Most people who watch this story will take from it a lesson about composure, about not snapping, about staying calm when someone tries to humiliate you, about the power of silence over reaction. And that lesson is real and worth keeping. But the deeper lesson, the one underneath that one, the one that actually changes how you move through the world, is this. You cannot fake unaffectability. You cannot perform security you do not have. You cannot project the calm of someone who has done the work if you have not done the work. Marcus tried to project strength all evening, and the projection collapsed the moment real pressure arrived, because there was nothing underneath it. Steven did not project anything. He simply was what he was. Fully, quietly, without apology and without announcement. And when the pressure arrived, when the whole table was watching and the stakes were real and the moment demanded everything, there was no gap between who Steven appeared to be and who he actually was. That gap, the space between the person you perform and the person you actually are, is where most people get destroyed. Close that gap. That is the work. That is the only work that actually matters.